an element of strategy. And I think that's the important point to have in mind, is that first of all, there was very technical compliance. Then gradually, over the late 1990s and the early 2000s, so at the start of the 21st century, for firms, compliance gradually evolved as an element, a subcomponent of risk management, risk assessment. And so that was a first change of trend, and a first, I would say, stretching out of the compliance function. But what seems to be the case now is that it's going even further, and it's really related to what we were talking about, the outcomes-led, the fifth stage of development of regulation and compliance, of the couple of regulation and compliance, that it is now also a tool. I mean, it's still a tool to control, to monitor, to identify risk and to manage risk, but it is now also adding a new dimension to it, that is the strategic thinking, the anticipation, the look in the future. And so that's the key message from the Compliance Survey 2020 by Deloitte. So I find it quite interesting. And they consider that if that function, the compliance function, is being stretched to address future challenges, they add that compliance professionals will need to focus on clearly defined compliance activities, invest to address the skill gaps, and rebalance teams with appropriately skilled staff. The point here is to say that because of that evolving nature and function of compliance, you have to make sure that the skills within the compliance department or the compliance teams are adapted to these new function and the new dimension of the compliance function. The NASDAQ Compliance Survey 2020 is interesting because, first of all, the NASDAQ, as you know, is online stock exchange. Okay, the NASDAQ annual global compliance survey, it's the 6th year. Okay, they've been doing this survey for the past 6 years. It is a survey that focuses, of course, on financial firms, because I mean they're focusing on the firms that are member of the NASDAQ, and the NASDAQ is an online stock exchange. So obviously they work with investment banks, traders, and things like that. Those are their immediate clients. And the title of their 2020 survey is Accelerating Surveillance Technology Demand from Financial Firms During COVID-19. Why is that? Well, what's interesting is that they realized through that survey that one of the most important focus is that what they call the WFH, the work from home, okay, the home office aspects, so online working, of course, was the most immediate and profound impact of the coronavirus crisis, or the consequence of the COVID-19 crisis that had an impact on all social and business activities. Well, one of the clear elements in the working environment was to move towards work from home, okay, or home office, what sometimes the Europeans call teleworking. Okay. And of course, what they're saying is that, well, because of that, it means that there was a major challenge in terms of compliance and in terms also of surveillance and communications monitoring that totally changed. And so the main result of that survey, the NASDAQ's last survey, is that investments by financial firms. Okay? We're talking here about financial firms. The investment in data quality and monitoring are the top priority in 2021, whereas in 2020, the priority was in core infrastructure. There was a greater focus on setting up core infrastructure, and here we're talking about technology, deploying the technology that you can use within your firms that meets your needs. So the core infrastructure was the priority of 2020. And of course, that priority was not only, but partly a consequence of the COVID-19 situation, because it forced firms. And if I look at what happened in France, it's very interesting. Major firms, big firms, were quite intensely already concerned with their IT infrastructures, and it was part of their internal processes, industrial processes, administrative processes, and all that. But the smaller firms, especially in business, the local shops, were not much into e-commerce and things like that, and so the COVID-19 situation was like a driver, a forced driver of change, of radical change, and even small local shops have actually, if they wanted to maintain some activity, some business, they had to, switch to what we call click and collect, to online offers of their services, and that has, of course, in its wake, that has brought in a lot of changes. Now, of course, small firms are less concerned with compliance, especially if they're not in the financial sector, obviously, and there are not that many small firms in the financial sectors. But so that's a general change. Now, for financial firms, since they were already pretty much into these new technologies, one of the reasons being that the financial services industry today is heavily reliant on IT, okay, because everything is done online through different processes. And I'm not even talking about AI applied to, and smart contracts applied to the financial sector, which is another story, but which is also an important element, and the development of fintechs and what we call regtechs, okay, regulatory tech firms that try to come up with new instruments to meet regulatory aspects. And so the NASDAQ Annual Global Compliance Survey 2020 actually has top 4 key takeaways for 2020. And once again, that came from the survey. So what happened in 2020? First of all, the first takeaway is that the pandemic heightened the challenges, increased the challenges, and shifted the focus areas for the compliance personnel and compliance teams. Okay, why? Because financial firms had to adjust their monitoring and alert coverage to adapt to the remote work transition. The fact that people moved outside of the office premises to work from home had, of course, a direct impact on how you adjust the monitoring of the activity. And this happened in a period of extreme market volatility, okay? And so some of the 2 most important elements that compliance firms had to face during the year 2020, and 2021 is probably not very different on this point, was that market manipulation and alert management were the 2 most important trade surveillance requirements of 2020. The first few months, or the first semester of 2021 doesn't seem to be much different. So that's the first key element that comes from the survey. The second element was the budget allocation that have shifted to core functionality. Most respondents of that survey have said, and I think it's 1/3 of the respondents of the survey have said that the budgets that are allocated to compliance were increased in 2020, and that they expect that this trend will continue in 2021. Okay, and so there's a lot of investment that has been decided on the what we call the core technology functionalities. As a consequence, which is an interesting consequence, is that the planned investment in innovations were not totally frozen, were put on hold. Okay, so the impact on compliance teams is that firms have refocused part of their budget on building up internal expertise, compliance expertise, and also hiring experience or non-experienced, but hiring more compliance personnel, okay, to meet these increased challenges. The fourth element that came out of the survey, which is interesting, especially after what we're going to talk about just after, is that reputation management. Reputation management is still considered to be a driver of all the investment decisions that are made in new in new software, okay, or organization, what is called the reg tech, okay, the regulatory tech investment. And so reputation management remains the most important aspect. And that is quite normal. It is quite coherent with what we said. One of the evolution of the regulation that applies to the financial industry, financial services industry, but also more generally, is that there's a lot of soft law. So there's a lot of principle-based rules that are being put in place, rather than just having a sanction, okay, a rules-based approach. The practical consequence for firms is that part of their risk has moved away from a legal risk, a purely legal risk, to a reputational risk. Why? Because remember what we said, it's less about breaking a rule than about not applying, not behaving in a way that is considered as acceptable. And that is why the ethics, the business ethics aspect have become so much important. But we know that, of course, a non-ethical behavior can bring a legal risk. I mean, if the non-ethical behavior within the firm results in bribery, results in breaking a law, then you have a legal risk. But part of the non-ethical behavior is only sanctioned by reputation, by bad reputation. All right, and so that is why it has become so high on the agenda for firms. And the last, I would say, key takeaway from the NASDAQ compliance survey, the latest one, is that the importance of compliance to firm operations keeps growing. Okay, nearly 3/4 of the respondents reported that their organizations considers compliance standards highly important, which is a clear jump in just 3 to 4 years. Okay, because in 2016, for example, there was only just over 50% of the respondents that considered that within their organizations, compliance was highly important. Today, it's nearly 75%, and that is coherent and makes sense with what we've said and what we've mentioned up to now. So I think that that's an important aspect, because it's parallel to the fact that new compliance is bringing compliance, or giving compliance, a seat at the table in executive conversation, and at top management level. And so compliance is not just an internal process to make sure that things are running, following the rules and following your internal rules. It's not just a monitoring instrument. It's much more than that. It's related to risk management and the strategic thinking that takes place within the firm. So these surveys, and I'll upload them on the Canvas platform, but these surveys are important as they really reflect the primary role of compliance and the compliance function in today's world, and that is true globally, but even more so in the financial sector. Okay, but that's true also in other types of firms, even though we are focusing on the financial sector. And I would ask that one of the probably the latest development in compliance, if we want to talk in global terms, or in taking one step back, is that probably one of the most important shift today within compliance is the drive towards greater efficiency, because it has become such an important function within the operations of organizations. It has to be improved in terms of efficiency, and that is probably why hiring and budgets, of course, follow that trend, which is a constant increase and a priority. And to a certain extent, that is exactly what the COVID-19 situation has helped trigger. Once again, I think I've said this before, but it's important to understand, the COVID-19 hasn't created this trend. It has accelerated a trend that pre-existed, and we see that in many areas. The COVID-19 hasn't so much as created new situations, but because it has changed the context, it has accelerated a set of trends that pre-existed, and that will not go away even if we end the COVID-19 situation. That's the main thing main lesson to understand. If the COVID-19 has just accelerated trends, it means that these trends, they were there before and they will remain after. Maybe a bit change, but they will remain. That's important. And the Deloitte survey is interesting because there's one element in that survey where they focus, a set of questions where they focus on what is keeping compliance leaders up at night. Okay, why can't compliance officers or team leaders, why can they not sleep well at night? What are their concerns? And the biggest challenges facing compliance over the next 24 months, so 2021 up till 2022, nearly 40% of the respondents of the Deloitte team said it's about resource capacities or capabilities. Okay, so it's about the ability to address the issues and the challenge. Then the second item that keeps them awake at night are regulatory change. And that, of course, of course, the impact of the health crisis has triggered a lot of changes, of regulatory changes, and some of them temporary, okay, transitional, just to address the situation. But there are also a lot of regulatory change that are not directly linked to the COVID-19 situation. The third element that really bothers compliance leaders, the third element is concerned with the coordination between the different control functions within the firm. So it's a technical concern here. And the fourth, and I find it interesting, the fourth is senior management support. They are concerned with that, which is interesting because depending on the firm culture, okay, depending on how the firm addresses these compliance issue and the compliance function, there's a large number of compliance leaders that consider that they probably do not get a sufficient support from senior management because it's a concern. So if they were getting it, it wouldn't be that much of a concern. And 17% of the respondents in the Deloitte survey said that, you know, senior management support is something that keeps them awake at night because they need it, they badly need it, and they probably do not get exactly the level of what they should be receiving. Last figure that I like to extract from that Deloitte survey is that over half of the respondents believe that the challenges that they are faced with today would exist regardless of COVID-19. Okay, and so that's just what I was saying just a bit earlier, is that the actual pandemic, the situation that we are experiencing across the world in different shapes and forms, of course, is accelerating changes, is forcing people to address new challenges, to look at the future. But many of these and most of these challenges would exist regardless, even if the COVID-19 had not happened. And so this is an important element because to a certain extent, the COVID-19 is an eye-opener. Okay, it's a driver and an eye-opener, but it is not the cause of the changes that we live in, especially in here I'm talking about, of course, I'm talking about compliance. All right, so these are recent elements that are interesting. Now, I want to come back to the link between ethics, business ethics, and compliance. Obviously, obviously ethics is an important part of compliance. Now, how do we get along putting that into place? How do we create an environment that is ethical? And that's where I'd like us to listen to Shefali Roy and Alexander Wagner. Interesting position on the role of ethics. So we'll listen to two speakers. One on why do ethics matter. Okay, and it's the first point that goes into it, and then the other one on how do you create motivation for honesty? How do you create motivation for ethical behavior within firms? And then we'll be just looking at. Wait, see if I got it here. We'll be looking at a set of elements about different ethical situations that are actually quite common, or that can be common in firms, and how do you address them, just to illustrate those aspects. And then I'll be moving on towards the financial sector regulation, and how the corporate governance, compliance, and ethics are intertwined and how they function together. All right, and when you listen to the talks here, think about what you heard when you watched Alex Edmans talk about social responsibility, and what are the drivers, why social responsibility and a social responsible approach makes sense and is not in opposition with economic growth and development. And maybe I'll try to, oops, no, wait a minute. Not what I want to do. And maybe I'll try to ask you questions just after. So first talk is, where is it? About Shefali Roy. Why do ethics matter? Okay, copy, paste. So listen carefully. I'll be asking you a set of questions just after on her talk. You see how the title of her talk is extremely relevant for what we're looking at. Why do ethics matter? And is there a place for ethics in a world that is constantly ignoring them? So she's already taking a position here. So I'll let you listen to Shefali Roy. Okay. All right. I hope that this was clear enough that you've understood. I don't know if there are any questions regarding some points that you might not have understood, but do not hesitate. I would have a question for you. Are you familiar with the Panama Papers? What the Panama Papers were. So that's an interesting element. All right, so you are familiar. So what can we say about the Panama Papers? What was it exactly? I see somebody's typing. Can I review the case again? Okay. The Panama Papers are called like that because of Panama, okay, the little Latin American country. The Panama Papers are basically I think 2.6 terabytes of data, or if you want, I think there was nearly 12 million leaked documents. Now, the Panama Paper is the result of an organization of journalists, okay, that get together and that try to investigate across the world a series of issues. Now, in this case, it is a leak of nearly 20 million documents that detail financial and attorney-client information for nearly 215,000 offshore entities that were leaked in 2016. The documents, they in time, they go all the way back from the 1970s up till the years 2015. And they came from a law firm, a Panamanian law firm and corporate service provider called Mossack Fonseca. Okay. The documents were interesting because they contain financial information about wealthy individuals, public officials, and offshore companies. And the reporters found that there were a lot of shell corporations, okay, what we call shell Chadit Roy, by the way, uses the term shell corporation. A shell corporation is a shell, like what you find on the beach, you find in the sea. So it doesn't have any operational substance. It's a shell, just to lodge in financial data, financial transaction documents, and things like that. Now, shell companies and offshore companies, offshore business entities are not illegal. For a private individual, okay, for whether a wealthy or public official to have an offshore account, is not necessarily illegal. Okay, it depends of the laws of the place of residence of that person. So as a, for example, as a Frenchman, I can have a foreign bank account. Okay, the only thing that I cannot do is I cannot I cannot hide it. I have to disclose it to the tax administration. But it's perfectly legal to have a declared offshore bank account, okay, in another country. So in itself, what the Panama Papers have, and the Panama Papers scandals that have revealed was all these the way these financial transactions and movements of monies were organized. All right. Now, some of them, not all, but some of them were actually used for illegal purpose, including fraud, tax evasion, and evading international sanctions. But what's interesting in this case is that the Panama Papers were not highlighting illegal situations. And the illegality, some of these situations might have been illegal, what was illegal depended on the laws of the countries of the people that were concerned. Okay, depending on where you were located, that was illegal or not. And so what's interesting about the Panama Papers is that it mainly raised an issue of ethics. People talk about morals. I don't like talking about moral because it's not really about moral. It's really about ethics. So the Panama Papers are a very interesting situation where a large group of international journalists, I mean, or let's say a large international group of journalists, this is journalists in different parts, revealed the financial and business practices of some individuals and some businesses. Well, not just some. I told you over nearly 215,000 that were not illegal, but that could be debated on ethical grounds. And public opinion reacted to that. Okay. And so it was, if we set aside the few cases, there were not that many within the Panama Paper disclosure and leaking, the few cases that were illegal, most of them were not. Okay. It had nothing to do with illegality. It was only about ethics. That's why the Panama Papers are interesting. So they're not that old. Okay, it's 5 years ago, and before that, there was the same group of journalists, the same consortium. It's a consortium of journalists. The same consortium had published the Paradise Papers. Now, the Paradise Papers were also a leak of documents, of financial documents, but the Paradise Papers probably were more concerned with laws and criminal or at least illegal activities rather than ethics. Why? Because the Paradise Papers were about using tax paradise, what we call tax havens, in order to avoid or to reduce, to optimize your tax burden and what you're paying in taxes. So the Paradise Papers that had been released a few years before were actually pinpointing, identifying illegal activities because they were pinpointing tax evasion and tax fraud. The Panama Papers, a bit different because they can only show situations that can be debated on ethical grounds and not on the legal aspects. So I think that's an important element. And what's interesting is that this was an international debate, because once again, it's a consortium of journalists, and when they release, they get access to these leaks, they work on them. It takes them a few years, huh, of course, because I mean, when you're talking about 12 million documents, you don't just overview them over the weekend. Huh? You can't go through all these documents over the weekend. So it takes teams in different countries looking into them, understanding them, to deciphering them, and then writing articles about them. So when they released that, they released it internationally. So some journalists in France and Germany and in the US and Asia and different parts at the same time, they had worked together at the same time they published these articles. So the Panama Paper is also an interesting illustration of the globalization that we live in today. It also means that there is a global public opinion that is appearing, which is complicated because, of course, public opinion depends on culture and history. So it's not a uniformized public opinion, but there is this public opinion. And that explains, and I think that explains very well why ethics, ethical consideration, reputational risk have become so high on the agenda of firms. Okay? We see how, if you think about the Panama Papers, we see how this shows that we've changed the world that we live in that regard, which, by the way, is problematic. Think about it, and think about this situation. I am a firm. I am not breaking any laws. I do have some corporate engineering with some offshore entities, just in order to facilitate and to optimize my accounting, my financial situation. But I'm not doing anything illegal. I'm not avoiding paying taxes or anything. I am being pointed out as having an unethical behavior just because I'm trying to, well, do things for the survival of my operations, of my company, for the viability of my company. And you see the difficulty here where at the management or senior management level, you're going to have to balance out certain behavior, certain acts that are in favor of your firm, that are not illegal. And I'm not talking about anything illegal, of course. And at the same time, that could be considered, that could be seen as unethical. It's a real dilemma and it's a real element of complexity for business people. Now, I'd like to ask you another question, still based on that talk, on the talk by Shefali Roy, and why does ethics matters? Just in a couple words, okay? In her view, and in one or two words. Now, think about this. In the Vietnamese context, or Asia, okay? And my question here is just also to see, do you think that if you're thinking from a Vietnamese point of view, Vietnamese perspective, do you think your answer is different, or it's not? And that can be an interesting way to try to understand the behavior that you can favor within your organization, or on the other hand, that you have to try to make sure that it doesn't take place. I'm giving you some time to type your answers. That's true. As you're rightly pointing out, it can be unethical behavior can be responsible for this. She mentioned the Bangladesh episode, which is the name of that case is the Rama Plaza. The name of the name of the name of the case of the Bangladeshi case is Rama. The Bangladeshi case, by the way, is is also a very interesting. Well, it's not an ethical dilemma, but it's a very moral hazard. I totally agree. But the Bangladeshi case is an interesting point to consider. Think about it this way. It does seem unethical that there were so many deaths, about over 1,000 people, 1,100, I think, people that died. Workers in a clothes factory, in a garment factory. And they died because of optimization, to say it simply, or greed, is that the owners of that garment factory were not much concerned about the health and security requirements about the building. They just crammed in as many people as they could, as many operational units they could in the building, and they even added different stories to the building in order to have more people working there, just to meet the orders that they were receiving from retail firms selling garments. Okay. So it seems that there's something unethical on that side. And on the other side, think about it, the Bangladeshi owners, the firm that owned the Rama Plaza, was not in violation, in breach of any Bangladeshi law. Okay, it was not violating those laws. Okay, and so this is where you really see the difference. Okay, now what's interesting here, and this is why you have to think about it when you work in multinational firms. If you're a Vietnamese multinational, okay, and you have operations in different parts of the world, you could always say, well, I'm respecting regulation. And if I have a contract with one of my subcontractor, which is outside of Vietnam, in another country, I am not responsible for the compliance of that subcontractor or just that contracting party. I am not responsible for how that other person, that third party, is actually complying with its own rules and regulation. And this is where the ethical aspect steps in. But you might still want to know what your subcontractor is doing because of the ethical aspects. If something goes wrong, that could backfire on you, on your reputation. Although you're not legally responsible for the behavior of your subcontractor that is subject to another law, the ethical debate could damage your reputation. And that's exactly what happened in the Rama Plaza. It's that the international firm that had contracts with the Bangladeshi firm suffered from the consequence, because what was said in public opinions, well, yeah, maybe you're not responsible. You did not, of course, cram in so many people on premises that could not hold that number of operational units and factories and all that. But you're the one that gave the order to have the garment built, and you're the one that tried to lower the prices, so cutting the benefit. So you do have a responsibility. Yes, it is not a legal responsibility. It is a moral one. It is a question of ethics. Okay, so to that extent, we see why does ethics matter. We see exactly why ethics do matter to firms, and will matter to firms in a very complex environment today because of this internationalization and globalization, because ethical failures or failings can actually have damageable consequences on a firm, even when there is no violation, no breach of a rule. Okay, and so it becomes, that's why you realize how it becomes an important aspect of strategy in your firm. And so this brings us to, well, this will of course bring us to compliance. Compliance is going to take this in its hand, is going to take the ethical concern in its hand through the processes that it's going to set up. Ethics and values, they provide the justification for most regulatory standards, and of course these ethical principles will help regulators and firms understand what they should do and how to do it. And so basically the link with compliance is the following. There's a partnership between ethics and values on one side and principles that come from rules and regulation on the other side. And that's the fundamental work of compliance, translating these theoretical aspects into practice. Okay, the principles are necessary to set out expectations, the boundaries of what can and cannot and should not be done, and give rule of thumbs, the direction, pointing out in which direction you're supposed to be going, with one thing in mind: what are the acceptable outcomes? And so ethics provide the starting point to understand direction and intent. And so that is why ethics is so important within compliance, because compliance, it's about ensuring firms are in accord with externally set parameters and standards that have to be translated into operational guideline internally. And so these expectations are important. So if compliance rests on ethics, the question is about identifying ethics on the one hand, and knowing how you approach ethics, and how do you actually develop ethics? How do you put that into practice? What are the main tools for identifying and applying corporate ethics? All right, so that's what compliance is concerned with. Think about it this way: ethics helps compliance to apply regulatory principles and rules as they explain the underlying idea behind the intent and the effect of these principles. So ethics is a very important, it's not the only, but it's an important root cause. It's at the basis of the risk. And for example, one of your colleagues talked about moral hazards. So how, sorry, so how, what are the ethical framework that you can think of in financial services? Well, I'll give you the three main principles or guidelines that the FSA, Financial Service Authority in Great Britain, gave in 2002. It's not recent, but and the FSA doesn't exist. As I told you, it's the FCA now. It went from Financial Service Authority to Financials Conduct Authority. But in 2002, in one of the FSA discussion paper, it offered an ethical framework for financial services by saying that the core ethics were: first, open, honest, responsive, and accountable behavior. Okay, open, honest, responsive, and accountable. Second, a commitment to act competently, responsibly, and reliably. And third, relating to colleagues and customers fairly and with respect. So fair and respectful treatment of both colleagues, that's within the firms, and towards customers. And that's the framework. It's very, very, very general in terms, but that's the framework. These are the core ethics that cover how a firm is to behave and how it should function. So if we say this, how does a compliance practitioner is going to approach ethics? Well, the first step is to understand, of course, what ethics are and establish a list of examples of ethics that apply in a firm. And so you will start with things like, fairness, equity, honesty, responsibility, reliability, care. And this, once you've laid down the core ethics, try it. Okay, so core ethics have to be identified. So, for example, let's say fairness. Then you go towards what we would call derivative ethics or secondary ethics. That's ethics that expands upon the core ethics, but depend on that. For example, openness and transparency are ethics. But what they are ways of ensuring and demonstrating honesty. Okay, they add strength to honesty. So some of the terms about ethics, responsibility, are so broad that they need to be qualified. Okay, such as responsibility to whom, shareholder, stakeholder, etc. And then you have to define, what do you mean by responsibility? So this is an exercise that you can easily do by yourself, is to define your own ethics. And it's an interesting exercise to do, to see if when you try to define your own ethics, are they different from the people that that are in compliance or other parts of the business? Are they different from the firm's collective ethics? You all work in companies. You might try to think about this for a minute. What are my core ethics? What do I believe as core ethical principles? And then think about, what is my firm's collective ethics, if it's worded out, because sometimes it's only implicit, sometimes there's nothing much. And you see if it's different. And if there's a difference, then you should try to ask yourself, what difference does this make to me? And what difference does it make to how I work? How do these differences appear in practice? Is anybody noticing? Is it something that people are noticing? Do you do anything about these differences? And are there any long-term implications of these differences, if there are any? So those are the kind of questions that have to be tackled when we're looking at ethics in business and business ethics, and remembering that ethics at work is not ethics at home. Okay, there's a difference. Now, there is a problem though here, and this is a question that I'm giving you, and there's no answer. But can we consider that you might have two different set of ethics? And so, for example, you could, consider that you can leave your good intention at the front door. Um, the truth is probably not. Now, even if in practice, ethics at home will not be exactly the same one at work, there is this idea that the compliance framework and the ethical parts of the compliance framework should try to reinstate the sorts of ethics that you would have exercised at home, but within the business environment. And so the final point is really to try to see how you actually can manage both. Anyways, the main point that you have to understand is that the compliance framework will try to implement the ethical behavior within a firm, and not just for the sake of being ethical. It's just because there are implications, consequences with that. And we will see after just what are the tools that you can use. Before seeing that, I want, oh wait, no, it's, okay, it's time for the pause. After, I wanted us to listen to, that's the last talk, to Alexander Wagner, because Alexander Wagner gives a talk, which is a shorter talk, gives a talk about why, how do you motivate internally for ethical behavior? Okay, it's not about how you create the ethical culture; it's how you motivate the individual agents. Okay, economic agent that play within the firm, because when at the end of the day, it's about the staffs, the employees, about the people, the managers, the people that make decision, the way they behave. That is what endangers or not the ethical behavior of the firm. Because the firm in itself will not do anything. The firm has no will. The firm is just a technical structure. It's how people behave from top senior management all the way down to the rank and file employees. All right, that's an important aspect. So we'll listen to Alexander Wagner talking about motivating for ethics and for honesty, and then I'll talk about the tools that can be used, and I'll bring up a few examples of compliance reports that will be a bit more technical. All right, but we'll have a break because it's okay. We'll have a 15-minute break. Sorry, 15-20-minute break, so you can have time to grab something for dinner, and then we'll be back on how do you actually, what are the tools that we can find within compliance and within the different internal processes. What are the tools that we can use to develop a compliance that will protect and favor ethical behavior, and thus reduce some of my risk as a company. Okay, so 15-20-minute break for dinner, and I'll be back just after. All right. I am back. And so we're going to start by listening to Alexander Wagner. And after that, I will be pulling up some compliance samples that illustrate very well the compliance program, and with a special, I would say, with a special look at the either ethical and or strategic aspect that you will find in them. Okay, but first, let's look at the motivations. Okay, that's very important. The motivations that we can think about in firms. All right, so that was Wagner about incentivizing people. Now, I find this talk interesting, especially because I think its main message, its core message, as it says at the end, is actually a problematic one. Is definitely a problematic one. Can you see why saying that, well, if you want to have ethical behavior, if you want to have good ethics within your organization, you have to choose the people with the right value. You have to have within your organization only the people with the right value. Do you not see how problematic that is? How difficult it can possibly be for a business if that's the way it has to function? Basically, the problem is that how can you really identify people with the right value? Now, of course, it means that in your recruitment process, you might want to throw in something that has to do with ethics and honesty and the relationship that the people has with the rules. But on the other hand, when you recruit for specific functions within a firm. And I would tend to say that it's not that the ethical behavior, but the private thinking, the way a person behaves is also part of its own individuality, its privacy. And you might say, well, as long as it accepts the functioning of the firm, I don't care what it thinks outside of the firm. Right? And one of the risks with, if we follow this recommendation, I think, and I think it's a really dangerous approach to thing, is that you are putting yourself in the place of judging people's ethics, people's value, and you are setting a standard that, in a way, can be problematic, especially in terms of non-discrimination, and even in terms of efficiency. What if I'm a company that needs engineers and I have two applicants, two engineers? One is definitely, obviously, much more efficient than the other. One has skills that are far greater than the other. Let's say this is engineer A. Okay, so the engineer A, if I look at its track record, at its its experience, I say, well, this is definitely the person that would fit the job. Not that B is a bad engineer, but he doesn't have the same skills. All right. Then I had, in my recruitment process, I had thrown in some kind of ethical test or relationship to authority and values test. And what comes out of it is that A has a terrible score. A doesn't respect much hierarchy. A, apparently, from this test, has a very, very flexible idea of what is ethical and non-ethical, and he can stretch the line quite far. Whereas B is extremely concerned with respecting authority, playing by the rules, has a very high standard, high moral standard, and high ethical standards. Which one do I recruit? Which one do I go for? Do I take A, that I know is the most perfect applicant for the job that I need to have done within the firm? And that is important because that's part of my business. Okay, that's concerned, and it's the success of my business that is guaranteed with engineer A. Engineer B, I'm sure I'll have no problem, and I'm sure he'll be very ethical, so I'm taking no risk, but that's not going to help my business. It's not going to help me grow my business. So in such a case, what do I do if I throw in these ethical values? Well, obviously you could say, well, I'm going to go for A or I'm going to go for B, depending on at what distance you put yourself in terms of ethics. You could also look at it differently, saying, well, maybe the tests that we put in place are not that relevant. Maybe I'm going to take the risk because I think that those tests, they give a general indication, but they're not that rational and objective. But you see how if you throw in ethics as a screening process, it's definitely a problem. And then it can also create problems in terms of justice. You know, you could say, well, I will never hire somebody that once was convicted, for example, but that's a different problem. It's a problem. It's not a firm level problem. That's a more of a society's problem. But you see how it's complicated. The other thing that I want to mention is that I find problematic with this talk is this idea that, well, incentives are fine, but you might be even doing things at a lower cost. Instead of burdening yourself with incentives and rules and different kind of organization, maybe all you need to do is to find the right people. And here again, what's problematic here is that it's fine, but we know that's not how it works in real life. We know that in real life, you need to have people that will be efficient and that will follow the rules that you're asking them to follow. All right. So my point here is just to say that it's not that easy to actually. Sorry, I'm missing something in my there. It's not. I think that actually defending this idea that you can easily reduce the cost of ethical compliance by choosing the people. I think it raises more concern, more difficulties than anything else, and so that's probably not the best way forward. But the talk is interesting because it shows also one thing that you always should have in mind is that ethics are relative, okay, in a sense that ethics will be different from one person to another. And so that's an important aspect that you need to have in mind here, is that the relativity of ethics, it's a question of people. But this is also why the tools, and I believe that's where the real element is, the tools are important. So what are the main tools for applying corporate ethics? Well, there's a set of tools, and I'm going to look at them just after, but there are at least eight tools that can be thought about, and the first three are directly related with the compliance process. The first main tool that we have, and people talk regularly, and in the talks we've listened to that was mentioned, it's writing an ethics code, having an ethics code, having some kind of roadmap that is accessible to all employees, right, and to everybody. And that ethics codes has to be reviewed regularly. Secondly, ethics training or compliance training, that it revolves about that. This is a fundamental aspect, training people, getting people to raise their awareness regarding those issues. Okay, so ethics training, however you do it, and we'll see in the case studies we'll be looking just after, those case studies really show how the training aspect, the internal educational aspect, are a fundamental element of compliance and of training. And that is true also for technical compliance. For example, within your compliance, you will have rules regarding, I don't know, money laundering or corruption. It doesn't make sense to only have those rules if you don't train the employees, the staff, to be familiar with them, and then to play the rules, to behave accordingly to those rules. And so the training is fundamental, even for more technical aspects. Finally, the ethical decision-making process needs to be put in place. And that's something that compliance will do. Compliance will often have a hotline, an internal hotline. And like this, when a question arises for the operational staff, and they're confronted with a choice or a decision to make, and they're wondering, they're questioning themselves about what is the ethical answer, or more frequently, is the decision that I want to make, is that ethical or not? Okay, I'm not asking the compliance officer department hotline to give me the answer. I'm just trying to check on whether or not the answer, the choice I want to make, the decision I want to make, the action I'm going to take is crossing some line in terms of ethics and compliance. So the ethical decision-making aspects are quite important. So these three first tools are fundamental elements of compliance, of embedding the ethical consideration in your compliance. The other tools that can be used to foster corporate ethics and to foster ethical behavior are ethics communication, and here, for example, there's this thing about this narrative about telling stories, okay, about good news stories, about trying to disseminate within the organization these stories about ethical, behavior. Ethics leadership then is again another tool. Now, ethics leadership is fundamental. It's what we call tone at the top. You'll have to understand the following thing, and this is true for any parts of leadership, whether ethical or other, or considering other aspects. There will be no ethical behavior within the organization if the leadership is not ethical. But it's not because the leadership is ethical and behaves ethically and promotes ethics that everybody will behave in an ethical manner within the organization. So what you have to understand is that ethical leadership is fundamental. It is obvious that if you have a CEO that keeps saying that the balance sheet and the growth is much more important than any other aspects, respecting customers, respecting the environment, crossing a red line, that corruption might be terrible, but if it's necessary to be number one in the job, then we'll do it. You can't expect the organization to function in a very ethical way. But even, so that's the first point, we'll call tone at the top. But even if the leaders, the senior management promotes ethical behavior, is serious about, I don't know, harassment, moral sexual harassment, about corruption, about fighting corruption, even if they're very serious, it doesn't mean that all risks are avoided. And that's why this is where I would disagree with Wagner. That's why it's not only a question of people, it's a question of incentives, of organizing things. So ethics communication, ethics leadership, 6 elements, I told you there were 8 of them, ethics database of useful precedents and learning points. This idea that anybody in the organization can actually consult and find precedent where questions have been raised or where problems have been met. And there's some kind of archive, okay? There's some data that is kept and accessible for people to be able to look into. And that can be very technical. For example, some clauses that we have in our contracts, maybe there was some kind of action in the past, and we know that those clauses are might be legal, but they raise reputational problems or ethical problems. So an ethics database can be quite useful, and there are different ways of actually using it within the organization. Seventh tool: systems, policies, and controls that support ethics. That means that your compliance processes have to embed the ethical aspects, have to embed the ethical concern. We will see that when we'll be looking at the one of the case. It's the Kobe Steel scandal. We will be looking at their compliance standard and sustainable developments. Well, no, sorry, the compliance standards, and we will see how the systems, policies, and controls supporting ethics that this concern had to be institutionally organized within the firm. And finally, a last tool that can raise moral issues and cultural issues are ethics reward and bonuses and career promotion. This idea that you're going to hold the staff and the people accountable for their ethics and you're going to reward them. Why? Because otherwise we know that symbolically, if you see somebody that has a very fast and quite quite successful career, but everybody knows that this is a person that tends to behave unethically. For example, will not hesitate to play tricks on some of his colleagues in order to appear to be better, those kind of things. And if he gets promoted while the others that are not engaging in those unethical behavior do not get promoted, then you do have an incentive and a symbolic representation problem. And so ethics rewards and bonuses and career promotion is an important aspect. It is also a very tricky one. Okay, it is a very tricky one because depending on the type of organization that you're in, you also want diversity. You want people to be able to come up with maybe new ideas. And if you impose a certain way of behaving and you promote those, you reward those that follow that way of behaving, and you do not reward those that come up with maybe good ideas but in behaving differently, then you might be creating a problem. But ethics rewards in bonuses and career promotion is definitely a tool that can be used, that can be considered when trying to implement an ethical behavior and to foster an ethical behavior, knowing that at the end of the day, bottom line is that by doing so, you are mitigating, you are reducing your risks. Why? Because you're reducing the risk of an action taken on behalf of the company that would be illegal, and you are reducing the risk of a reputational problem of an action that, although being legal, would create a reputational issue and damage. And so, at the end of the day, embedding your ethical, your business ethics, your ethical behavior within your compliance system is important, even if you're just looking at figures, at hard figures. It's just looking at the balance sheet of the company. And you're mapping out the risk that they're following. I want to show you an example of, here, yes, of an ethics and compliance program, the Office of Ethics, Compliance, and Audit Service of the University of California. So wait, I'm just going to upload it. Yes, I have it here. Oh, there it is. Okay, here. Okay, there I have it. Okay, the University of California. Now, this is a document about 4 or 5 years ago. The Ethics and Compliance Program Plan for the fiscal year FY 2016-2017. The content is interesting. So there's a background and overview where it explains the ethics and compliance program and the development of that program, right? And by the way, it has an interesting element regarding the constraint that leverage the compliance and the ethics and compliance approach. And then it has the key compliance risk focus area. And for the University of California, these risks are related to safety, to the research compliance risk, okay, to the activity, the research activity creates risk in terms of compliance, government reporting, international compliance, health science compliance, that is specific to health science, the data privacy and cybersecurity. Can I not grow this? Yes, I can. Might be better. Oops. Okay. Okay, so so here we have the data privacy and cybersecurity and general compliance. The general compliance goes on more specifically that are interesting is that the conflict of interest and the third party relationship risk that has to do with corruption. Okay. And the last point is interesting here. You see that they have a chapter on culture of ethics and compliance. Okay, how do you actually bring that into practice? All right. Now, what I'd like to look at is just a couple of things. It's slide by slide. Okay, it is. This is interesting. Now, what is this about? This is about the pressure that you have on your compliance program. In order to deploy your compliance program in your organization, you have different constraints. Now, obviously, one of the first ones that you have to take into account are the regulatory requirements, the rules, the laws. They create a constraint, a pressure on your organization, because that will give you the framework or the general framework on how you can organize your internal processes. Then, of course, the cultural aspects are essential, because cultural aspect will tell you what is possible, not possible, what is avoidable, not avoidable, okay, and how to deal with it. But also what is acceptable in terms of standards and what is unacceptable, generally speaking. And finally, a third source of pressure or constraint is the budget. Why? Because your compliance program, your compliance program, and the even within including the ethical aspects, has to be deployed in real life in the organization. And that means you need people, you need processes. Well, people and processes, which the processes could rely also on technology, all this means that you need a budget for that. It's not the same thing if you have a two-person compliance department or a 20-person, all right? It makes a great difference. It also depends on the size, of course, of the organization. But you see that the budget aspects, the money aspect, the finance aspect is important, because depending on the budget that I have, I can either develop an extensive compliance program, or I have limitations on what I can do. So if you take those three sources of pressure, at the intercrossing of them, this is where you have to organize and set your compliance program. Your compliance program that you will be capable of designing and putting in play, okay, and enforcing, is the one that's going to be at the crossroad of the regulatory requirements, the budget constraint, and the cultural aspects, okay? And where this crosses, what we mean by that is that where they are not in opposition and that they are combined, this is the space that you have. This here, this is the space that you have for deciding and setting up your compliance program. Now, the general program, and that's what's interesting, the general program, and this slide will enable us to really understand how you come up with a compliance program. You have to put it in a framework. And so what do we have here? We have 3 layers. The 3 layers are, here is one, then here you have a second one, and here you have the core, so the center. So to design your compliance program, you start by your missions and your values. You identify, and usually they're written down somewhere, what are your missions and your values. 2 different things. My mission, is what am I supposed to do? What is my organization supposed to do? So if I'm a bank, it's lending money. But my mission might be lending money, that develops that favors sustainable types of projects. And then my value will be, if it's sustainable type project, will be abiding, protecting the environment, or respecting the environment, or being cautious about environmental impact of my activities. It'll be about discrimination. It'll be about fairness. Those are the values, the mission and values. Once you have your mission and values, then you look at all the elements of an effective compliance program. Now, this will be true in any compliance program, whereas the compliance risk pressure around will depend on the type of organization and the type of activities you are engaged with. So what are the elements of an effective compliance program? Well, if we look at them more in details, these are, these are the elements of the compliance program. You need oversight. That means you need to be able to have a general view of all the different bits and pieces of the compliance program. You need policies and procedures, definitely, okay, because you need to have the rules of the game known by everybody. You need enforcement and discipline. Yeah, obviously, if you have rules, you need to have some kind of enforcement, and you need to have some kind of discipline, because if you witness breach of those policies, irrespectful behaviors, non-ethical behavior, you need to have some kind of discipline. You should have response and prevention. Now, response and prevention, that's interesting. Prevention, as I told you, is one of the major elements of compliance today. It's not necessarily about fixing things. It's about avoiding the occurrence of something that could be damageable for the organization. So prevention is important. And of course, the response is how you react either to a crisis or to a given situation where there is a questioning about whether or not the action is compliant with the missions and values and the ethical framework. Training, I talked about it earlier. Training is fundamental, and training is linked to communication and transparency. You have to have in your compliance plan, how do I organize communication? How do I organize the transparency? What are the basic principle I will apply to that? And because this is the fundamental aspect. And so, of course, and I should have started by that, monitoring. You monitor what's going on in your organization. And actually, these two are linked, as well as this. Okay, you're going to monitor through the general oversight and through the policies and procedure. Okay, because policies and procedure are a consequence of the oversight. Now, where am I going? How my organization is functioning. All right, so that's these are the elements of an effective compliance program they have to consider. And then once you have this, your missions, your values, the different chapters of your the different points that you have to address in your compliance program, then you will add to that and you will put in the picture your compliance risk pressure. That means you have to identify, where do my risk come from? What types of risk do I have? And that will enable you to actually develop your compliance program more specifically with more articulate views about the content. So in this case, this is the University of California, and the University of California, of course, engages in research and teaching. So what are their risks? Which will give you a good idea of how you should think about it in your organization. And obviously, if we're looking at a bank or investment or a trader, the compliance risk pressure will not be the same. So one general source of compliance risk pressure is safety. Safety on the premises, safety within the buildings, in the labs, all these elements, but it's also safety of the staff and the personnel. It's and that safety can be both physical, their integrity, their physical integrity, or it can be related to moral aspects. Okay, so safety of the people, of the constituent, the stakeholders of my organization is fundamental. You have, of course, government reporting. Now, government reporting actually can exist. It will exist depending on your type of activities, of course. All right. But we also know that your type of activities the type of activity means that your government reporting will vary, will be different. And if I'm in a firm, in a financial firm, I have another regulatory type of pressure. I have my accounting standards pressure, okay? And those are part of the reporting that I have to think about. The government reporting pressure in the University of California example has to be understood in the following way. There exists a uniform guidance, okay? The uniform guidance, which is a bit like a code, that represents the federal government, or the government of the United States, not the California state. The uniform guidance represents an effort to revise the standards governing the administration and expenditure of federal funds related to contracts and grants awarded to academic institutions. One of the problems with government or executive reporting is that depending on your sector, there might be a lot of them and they might conflict. If I take just the university context in the US, then the challenge is that even today in 2021, there are many federal agencies that have different types of standards over university and will apply them over university. So it creates a complex regulatory environment and requires a lot of effort for universities at the campus level. Okay, and now working on this government reporting or the financial reporting, this is where the audit teams play an important role. Okay, then we have international compliance, which creates a pressure. Now, why would international compliance create a pressure? Well, international compliance has to do with the fact that if your operations, if your activity is carried out worldwide, then if you have an international presence around the globe, then there are increased compliance monitoring activities and enforcement by the different regulators. Your national rules might, your laws might impose increased compliance, or just because of the reputational risk that you have, you're going to have to try to meet these different standards. So there's complexity here too. The last part about international compliance that you should consider, it's related to the FCPA, the Foreign Corruption Practices Act. That, you know, it implies education for all the stakeholders of the organization. Now, in the case of the University of California, you then have things that are very specific, and I will not talk about it. You have the health science. Now, why is health science a pressure, a compliance risk pressure in itself? Well, simply because health science has to meet certain standards and regulations. For example, there are some types of experiments that are unacceptable, okay, in terms of ethics. Okay, there are things you cannot do with clients just to test drugs or solution. There are also specific safety aspects that come with health science because of the experiments of the labs. So health science in itself, because of the nature of health science, is in itself a source of compliance risk issues that have to be considered. But see, that's not true in all types of firms. In a bank, that would not happen. In a pharmaceuticals company, yeah, you do have health aspect. I mean, you know, general health requirement aspect that create compliance risk pressure. The data privacy and cybersecurity seems obvious. I won't say much. Then we have general compliance. Okay, these are specific set. Now, general compliance is all about how do I actually, set about a general environment that fosters compliance. Under general compliance, you might also have very specific aspects that to be considered. And I'll give you just one example with the University of California. Under general compliance, the University of California has, for example, identified UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, basically drones, okay, drones. In 2016, when it actually adopted this plan, it was saying that the use of unmanned aerial vehicles has grown significantly, and the University of California researchers were actually resorting to drones to conduct research in different contexts. For example, marine migration, okay, marine mammals migration, whales migration, natural habitat evolution. You don't want to go there and trample the grass and all that. You're going to use drones. Coastline erosion surveys that the University of California works on, and so all of these use, and there are many others. They raise challenges, and so the University of California had decided that among the general compliance issues, at least in 2016, 2017, there was this element of drones, the use of drones to be considered, and so that was with general compliance. But there are also other things that are more generic in general compliance. For example, conflict of interest, conflict of commitment, and how do you address those? And finally, the last element that raised a pressure on the risk of non-compliance that they've identified is culture. And culture here is related, for example, with the problem of people with disabilities. Okay, the accessibility, including the electronic accessibility, the fair wage, fair work aspects. All these elements are related to culture. And when we think here about culture, you have to think of culture at two different levels. The overall culture of the environment that you are interacting with, and the corporate culture that you want to promote within the organization. All right, so that's a very important element that has to be considered and has to be looked into in designing your actual compliance program and then mapping out a plan. All right, so that's an example of what has been done and what can be done regarding a compliance program. Now there are other types, and they're posted on the Canvas platform. You have other compliance program. It gives you some feeling of what we're talking about in real life. Okay, so that is important, and I did want to start the corporate governance, but there are only a few minutes left in the class, so I'll call it a day. And tomorrow we'll talk about compliance, and we'll be looking into two cases. One is the Kobe Steel case. So you have the document on the platform. I'd like you to go over the there it is. I want you to go over Case 8, Fighting Corruption in East Asia. It's the Kobe Steel case. So we'll be looking at that. And case number 9, still about fighting corruption in East Asia. It's the LG Electronics case. And they're very different cases. They were addressed differently, but they are great illustration of the difficulties of having a compliance program that embarks ethics and ethics consideration. Okay, so we'll be looking at this tomorrow. So I want you to, in advance, just have a quick look, and you can read it very quickly. Those cases, they're not very long, and part of the case actually contains some elements of explanation and of understanding. So the first case is it's a 9-pager, and the other one, sorry, not the first case, the second case, the LG Electronics is a 9-pager, and the Kobe Steel is a 7-pager. Okay, so I'd like you to read that even very quickly for tomorrow. Like this, when we do these cases, we go into the details of these cases. You are really benefiting from that session and not just discovering the cases that we're using. All right, I don't know if there are any questions. apparently not. It's getting late. It's getting late in Vietnam, so probably time to, if not go to bed, at least have a rest, have a short rest before Friday's working day tomorrow. All right. Well, having said this, good night to all. Have a pleasant end of evening. A very good night, and I'll see you tomorrow. See you tomorrow.